The right question is not just where was Sodom, but rather, where was Lot when he lifted up his eyes and saw the whole plan of the Jordan? It was a place so fertile and promising that it felt like paradise itself, an oasis that would enchant anyone. It is said that there on Mount Sodom, Lot chose his destiny, a destiny that today makes us tremble. On a clear day, you can barely see the northern end of the Dead Sea, let alone the entirety of the region that, according to Genesis 19, was consumed by fire and brimstone from Yahweh. And it didn't stop there. Every person, crop, tree, branch, everything that breathed, was destroyed. The story of Lot's wife is one of the most defining moments in the Bible, a dramatic warning, a lesson in obedience and disobedience, and a mysterious event that defies the imagination to this day. Was it real? Many say yes. And now, archaeological evidence and historical accounts, such as Josephus's, resurface to confirm that the biblical tradition may be more literal than you might think. Imagine walking through the desert and suddenly coming across a pillar of salt, held up as a reminder that obedience to God is more than a choice. It's a matter of life and death. The archaeological remains on Mount Sodom, the layers of rock, salt, and the accounts of travelers over the centuries feed curiosity and also faith. After all, the story of Lot's wife is not just a legend told in temples and churches. It is an echo of warning that crosses generations. You may even doubt it, but science itself does not close the door to mystery. Sulfur deposits, rock formations that resemble human figures, the lingering smell of sulfur. All of this isn't just legend. It's part of a scenario that defies skeptics. Biblical tradition stands the test of time like the salt that covers Mount Sodom, a reminder that when God commands, He fulfills, and when He warns, it is better to obey. And now, my friend, I invite you to dive into this story, where faith, archaeology, and tradition intertwine to reveal what many didn't believe possible. They found Lot's wife. Are you ready to find out how this can transform the way you view the Bible? It was a clear, warm morning when Lot, standing next to his uncle Abraham, looked up and glimpsed the whole plain of the Jordan. The sight before him was worthy of an 8K film painting, a fertile valley watered by abundant waters that was the envy of even the most daring dreams of wealth. Sodom and Gomorrah gleamed in the background like jewels lost among the dunes. According to Genesis 19, this region was so rich that it looked like Eden itself, an irresistible invitation to those who, like Lot, sought prosperity. Along Mount Sodom, salt pans were formed that seemed to embrace the horizon, recalling the tragic outcome of Lot's wife transformed into a pillar of salt. This place, my dear friend, was not just a natural setting. It was the setting for a story that tells us about obedience and disobedience, about choices and consequences. It was no wonder that Sodom and Gomorrah attracted travelers and merchants from far and wide. Josephus, in his accounts, mentions the abundance of the region, which endorses the biblical tradition that Lot chose a prosperous land to live in. But ironically, it was there that his greatest spiritual challenge began. Among the salty hills, Lot's decisions would shape his family's fate and echo him as a warning for generations. What's fascinating, and sometimes frightening, is understanding how geography shapes human decisions. The Jordan Valley, at the foot of Mount Sodom, offered the traveler the promise of plenty, but it also hid the danger of yielding to the temptations of easy prosperity. The biblical tradition warns us of the risk of choosing paths only by appearance. Here, archaeological evidence reinforces the authenticity of the story. Charred ruins, layers of salt, remnants of destruction that prove that Sodom is not a legend. The pillar of salt is still pointed out as a vestige, an echo of obedience that turned into disobedience. Imagine yourself standing on the hot sands of Mount Sodom, with the wind blowing away memories of the ancient destruction. The horizon stretches and the plain of the Jordan shines like an irresistible invitation. But each step there is an invitation to reflect on our own choices. How often, like Lot, Do we look at opportunities that shine without measuring the consequences? The inner mentor teaches us, not all prosperity is a blessing. Sometimes the abundance that seduces hides dangers that turn lives into pillars of salt. And it is precisely at this crossroads of choices that the next stage of this epic journey begins. The divine instruction and disobedience of Lot's wife, a warning that echoes through the ruins of Sodom and the lessons of Josephus. Do you want to know how this affects us even today? Imagine the scene. The sun was rising on the horizon, tinging the salt dunes golden when the angels approached Lot with a clear command. Flee for your life. Do not look back or stand still in all this plain. Escape into the mountain, lest you perish. Genesis 19:17. It was a non-negotiable divine instruction, a line drawn between obedience and disobedience, between life and destruction. However, in the midst of the rush and chaos, Lot's wife gave in to the most human impulse: curiosity, longing, perhaps even doubt. In an instant, the punishment was relentless. It turned into a pillar of salt. This episode, dear reader, is not just a narrative of personal tragedy. He carries an eternal lesson about the weight of obedience. Lot's wife didn't just become a pillar of salt. She became a symbol of a heart divided between obedience and disobedience, between trusting in the divine call and clinging to the past. In the midst of the ruins of Sodom, every grain of salt is a witness that looking back, when God commands us to move forward, is the risk of spiritual petrification. How many times in our modern journey are we tempted to look back, fueling regrets that paralyze us? Josephus, in his Chronicles, mentions seeing the pillar of salt that he said was Lot's wife, living archaeological evidence that reinforces biblical tradition and the symbolic force of this account. It is curious how, centuries later, travelers still point to Mount Sodom and say, "There is the testimony of obedience turned into disobedience." The archaeological evidence in the region, which includes thick salt deposits and peculiar geological formations, leaves no doubt that there is something special about this place. Even today, scholars debate whether the pillar is a natural phenomenon or a divine miracle, but the lesson remains. Some people ask me, "But what about me? How do I apply this in my life?" The answer lies in daily discipline, obeying even when the heart wants to look back. If you miss something God has already asked you to leave, remember Genesis 19:26. And Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. It is as if the text itself shouts, "Don't play with disobedience." Obedience is the link that binds our faith to victory, while disobedience turns us into standing statues stuck in a past that no longer exists. And so, dear reader, we continue our journey towards Mount Sodom and the geology of that region. There, the earth itself tells us, with its salt formations and secular testimonies, that the Bible is not just an ancient book, but a guide to life. Want to find out how this fits with the story of Mount Sodom? Whoever steps on the soil of Mount Sodom feels the weight of centuries of stories. This mountain, shrouded in mystery and salt, stands like a natural wall, marking the point where Sodom and Gomorrah rose and collapsed. Mount Sodom is actually a gigantic geological formation composed of rock salt, covered in sedimentary rocks, which extends along the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The archaeological evidence here speaks loudly, pointing to a fascinating reality that connects faith and science. It is not for nothing that Josephus described the region as something that aligns perfectly with the biblical narrative. In Genesis 19:24-25 we read, "Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire from the Lord from heaven on Sodom and Gomorrah, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plains, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and he that was born in the earth." The text is impactful, not only because of its destruction, but because it connects geography to divine judgment. Mount Sodom, with its salt cliffs and natural caves, is a silent witness to this epic devastation. Lot's obedience and the disobedience of the woman who became a pillar of salt became as real as the rocks that support the mountain. Walking along the trails of Mount Sodom is like flipping through a book of living history. Each fragment of salt tells something about biblical tradition and the human insistence on defying what God commands. It is impossible to ignore the strong smell of sulfur, which some travelers still claim to smell in the region, a reminder of the judgment that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah. And, for those who doubt it, the salt formations sculpted by the action of wind and water confirm that nature is capable of sculpting monuments that tell millennial stories. Imagine yourself there, climbing the salt slopes, with the sun reflecting off the cliffs and the wind bringing back memories of a fiery past. A simple touch on a rock or the burning smell in the air makes us understand how alive the Bible is. Its stories remain rooted in the earth, the mountains, and even the smell. This is the strength of the biblical tradition, to transform ruins into witnesses. Josephus not only reported Mount Sodom as proof, he left us a trail for faith to dialogue with geography. And so, as if in an invitation, the story leads us to the next point of this journey: the existence of the pillar of salt. Is it myth or evidence? The answers, my friend, may surprise even the most skeptical. Some say that the pillar of salt, attributed to Lot's wife, is just the result of erosion, a geological curiosity like so many others on Mount Sodom. But for those who read Genesis 19:26, and Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt, the meaning goes much deeper. The statue is seen not only as a natural formation, but as an eternal reminder of obedience turned into disobedience. Josephus, the Jewish historian, confirms that in his time, centuries after the biblical event, the pillar of salt was still pointed out by travelers and pilgrims as living proof of the biblical tradition. This story is not just a legend of deserts. Archaeological evidence in the region of Mount Sodom shows that there are salt formations sculpted by the winds, forming true natural sculptures. Some of them, at first glance, resemble the shape of a woman. For those who are looking for a sign, it is as if nature itself conspires to confirm the biblical narrative. And it is not new. Historical records show that since the time of Josephus, travelers reported seeing the salt statue. This reinforces the strength of the biblical tradition and challenges skeptics who attribute everything to mere geological coincidences. Imagine, for example, walking along those trails and suddenly coming across one of these formations. It is as if time had frozen Lot's wife at the very moment she disobeyed. And it is not only in the Bible that this narrative persists. Christian, Jewish, and even Islamic traditions keep history alive as a symbol of obedience and disobedience. To this day, tour guides point to these formations with a mixture of awe and reverence. Maybe you've never thought about it, but the archaeology of faith is also made of stones and salt. On the other hand, science often challenges faith, explaining everything as natural processes of erosion. But is modern geology capable of completely refuting the biblical tradition? Mount Sodom, with its salt walls, bears witness to a history that is not so easily erased. After all, not all evidence is measured by scientific instruments alone. Sometimes the story itself engraved in the human heart speaks louder. Here, obedience and disobedience take the form of a statue, and the myth mixes with the reality of a people who saw Sodom and Gomorrah collapse in fire and brimstone. And so, history invites us to move forward. Who was Josephus, and what was his role as a witness to this pillar of salt? Get ready to travel back in time and discover how tradition, faith, and archaeology meet in the pages of history. Flavius Josephus, one of the greatest Jewish historians of antiquity, did not hesitate to record in his work, Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 11, that he saw with his own eyes the pillar of salt that would be, according to biblical tradition, Lot's wife. It is fascinating how the testimony of Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, echoes centuries later as living archaeological evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah. For many, his narrative is more than history. It is a bridge between Genesis 19 and the salt formations that persist on Mount Sodom. Here, the past meets the present, and obedience and disobedience continue to dialogue. Josephus naturally describes the existence of the salt statue, without questioning whether it was a myth or a miracle. For him, the Jewish tradition that Lot's wife was transformed into a pillar of salt was as certain as the walls of Jerusalem. The historian writes with the assurance of someone who trusts in the power of narratives that shape a culture. From their accounts, it is clear that Sodom and Gomorrah were not only places of destruction, but also of spiritual warning to all who dared to look back. Obedience was a matter of life and death. It is curious to realize that, even for such a respected historian, faith and history did not clash. They complemented each other. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt was not just an archaeological curiosity. It was, for Josephus, evidence that the biblical tradition was kept alive. Genesis 19:26 echoes in the mind of the reader. And Lot's wife looked back and became pillar of salt. The Bible was not only a book of laws, but also a record of life-changing events. Imagine yourself in a time without internet, without photos, without videos. What would make you believe something? For Josephus's readers, eyewitness testimony had a gigantic weight. If he said he saw the pillar of salt, who could doubt it? What's more, Josephus, respected by both Jews and Romans, had no interest in inventing stories. His reputation as a historian was at stake. This credibility means that his account is still cited by archaeologists and theologians who study Mount Sodom. And that's how we come to the next chapter of this journey, where religious tradition, be it Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, comes together to keep the story of Lot's wife alive. Have you ever stopped to think about why so many religions still preserve this account? Over the centuries, Sodom and Gomorrah have ceased to be just geographical places and have become spiritual symbols. Christian, Jewish, and even Islamic tradition keeps alive the story of Lot's wife, who became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19:26 continues to be read, debated, and interpreted in each of these traditions. For Christians, it is a reminder of obedience. For Jews, a warning to the seriousness of the biblical tradition, and for Muslims, a lesson in submission to the divine will. Isn't it curious how a single event echoes in so many cultures? This persistence is not mere chance. Josephus, by reporting seeing the pillar of salt, helped to consolidate the link between archaeology and faith. Many travelers even continue to point to Mount Sodom as proof that divine punishment is real. Archaeological evidence found in the region reinforces the existence of salt deposits and curiously carved rock formations, which serve as testimony to the strength of this narrative. Traditions intertwine, creating a web of meanings that goes far beyond simple historical curiosity. In the Islamic tradition, the story is narrated in the Quran, reinforcing the same lesson of obedience and faith. Lot's wife, called the wife of Lot, also became a pillar of salt, a sign of divine punishment for those who disobey. It is fascinating to see how the three great Abrahamic religions agree on the essence of the story. The price of disobedience is high, and looking back can cost one's life. Here, the salt statue transcends the geology of Mount Sodom to become a universal symbol. Imagine you sitting at home reading about these ancient traditions and realizing how they are still repeated today in preaching, religion classes, and even modern documentaries. It is as if the story of Lot's wife has crossed time to remind us that certain lessons never get old. Obedience is always challenging, whether in the desert of Sodom or in the urban chaos in which we live. Genesis 19 makes us look inside ourselves. Are we ready not to look back? And so we continue on our way to the next point, the spiritual symbolism of Lot's wife and what this pillar of salt represents not only in geology, but in the human soul. Ready to dive into this reflection? The pillar of salt that was once Lot's wife invites us to reflect on obedience and disobedience in a way that goes beyond geography or archaeology. Genesis 19:26 reminds us, and Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. This image in itself is powerful, but its spiritual meaning is even deeper. It warns us of the danger of looking back when God calls us to move forward. How? Many times do we cling to the past, paralyzed by nostalgia and attachments, becoming spiritual statues in the midst of a world in motion. This symbolism is echoed in Jesus' words at Luke 17:32. Remember Lot's wife. It is not just a historical reminder, but a spiritual summons not to be overwhelmed by hesitation. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for their wickedness, disobedience prevents us from moving forward to God's promises. Josephus reminds us that the biblical tradition is alive, and it makes us ask, are we obeying or turning into modern-day pillars of salt, standing in the middle of the path of faith? The pillar of salt, which is still pointed out today by tour guides on Mount Sodom, is more than an archaeological curiosity. He is a living metaphor for each one of us. What prevents us from moving forward? Fear? Attachment to the past? Lack of faith? When God commands us to press on, He expects total obedience. Genesis 19:17 makes it clear. Flee for your life. Don't look back. But how many of us do not resist this call, preferring stagnation to the risk of transformation? Imagine the weight of this in our daily lives. How many opportunities have we missed because we can't break old habits, memories, or pain? It's as if each of us has the potential to become an emotional salt statue. The lesson is clear. Obedience is not just a divine command. It is the path to liberation and full life. Josephus, in reporting the pillar of salt, reinforces this lesson. It is not just a historical event, but an eternal message. And it is precisely here, in the encounter between faith and science, that the next point of our journey arises. How? Biblical geography, historical records, and archaeological evidence help us better understand this history. Want to know how this strengthens faith and trust in God's Word? The journey of faith that runs through Sodom and Gomorrah through Mount Sodom is not only a spiritual journey, it is also a scientific journey. Genesis 19:24-25 clearly describes, "Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire from the Lord from heaven on Sodom and Gomorrah." This narrative has always intrigued archaeologists and geologists who wondered, was it just myth or historical fact? Well, archaeological evidence such as layers of ash, sulfur deposits, and collapsed structures point to real destruction, which fits perfectly with the biblical tradition. It is curious how, along Mount Sodom, geologists find huge deposits of salt and solidified sulfur, reminding not only of divine judgment, but also of God's power over nature. Josephus, by claiming to have seen the pillar of salt, united history and faith and paved the way for modern science to investigate the site. Many scholars believe that Mount Sodom, with its rock-salt cliffs, is one of the most intriguing geological formations on Earth. And it's not just visual. The smell of sulfur still hangs in the air at certain points, as a silent testimony to the ancient destruction. Imagine an archaeologist walking through the desert, collecting rock and salt samples. Each fragment he finds is not only geological evidence, but also a link between science and faith. It is as if the earth confirmed what the Bible had already reported. What's more, each discovery reinforces the importance of obedience and the risk of disobedience. Salt, the salt statue, fire, and brimstone are not only part of the landscape, but of human history itself. It is a living lesson in spirituality and science going hand in hand. The Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition see in these discoveries a confirmation that the Word of God is not only symbolic, but also concrete. The archaeological evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah is not hidden in laboratories, but in plain sight of all who visit Mount Sodom. The pillar of salt, even if it is interpreted in different ways by scientists and theologians, remains a witness that the past is not only history, but also a lesson of life. And Josephus, with his narrative, started this bridge between faith and science. And so, my dear reader, we close this chapter to pave the way for the great outcome of this journey. How faith, history, and archaeology come together to confirm the scriptures and strengthen our spiritual journey. Ready to receive these answers and, who knows, transform your view of biblical stories? Now that you've walked with me through every trail of history, archaeology, and faith, it's time to put everything you've learned into practice. After all, how many times have we let disobedience turn us into emotional salt statues, standing in the middle of life's path? Have you ever stopped to think about how many opportunities you missed because you were looking back, clinging to what you should have already left? If the story of Lot's wife teaches us anything, it's that looking back can cost us our future. What about you? What still holds you back? Is it fear? Is it hurt? Is it nostalgia for something that doesn't come back? Today is the day to move forward, to obey the voice of God, not to become a pillar of salt. The Bible, Josephus, the archaeological evidence, they all tell us the same thing. It's time to obey and move on. So I ask you, are you ready to leave the past in the past, to break away from what paralyzes you, to get out of the smoke of Sodom and live the fullness of life that God has for you? It is not enough to know the story. It is necessary to live the lesson. Leave your comment below telling me which part of this story impacted you the most and how you intend to apply this learning in your life. And if you are not yet part of this journey of discovery and faith, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way, you'll continue to learn about the archaeological evidence that supports the Bible and strengthen your spiritual walk. Remember, faith is alive, just like the salt that covers Mount Sodom, and its history is still being written. Are you ready to move forward?